that was very good. Thank you. Appreciate that. You know, it just goes to show, you know, we don't have to sort of go overboard, does it? Just be real. It's very good. And so true. Like all of those things are exactly why we do communion, why we remember those things. And it's an important thing that we remember. Now that's why, in fact, in the Word it says that we're to fellowship, we're to stay with fellow Christians, people who are like-minded, so we don't forget who we are, so that we don't feel that we're in a losing battle, that we don't feel isolated. In fact, that's the enemy's plan, is to isolate you. Because once he's got you on your own, he's got you. And that's why it's always something that we pray about for those people who've drifted a little bit away from their church for whatever reason it is. You know, we don't judge them for that, but we pray that they come back because it's the only safety we've got. And you know, it's a crazy thing. And sort of leads into a little bit what I want to talk about this week. And I was thinking about it during the week, and on Thursday night when we were doing our home fellowship and looking at Luke and how we've got to the point where we're looking at Jesus' life and how John the Baptist was basically a message to the world of what was coming. And often makes you wonder why the Jews missed out on the Messiah altogether. But of course that was the master plan. And I was actually thinking about it after Thursday night of what would have happened if the Jews hadn't actually missed the message. I mean, they did know who Jesus was, funnily enough, but they didn't make that connection. But then if they had, I wonder how things would have changed today, because he wouldn't have been put on the cross. Because they would have protected him rather than let him be made an example of. And the Jews let him be made an example of in a couple of ways, because they wanted to show the Romans who were running their country that, you know, hey, we understand your laws, leave us alone. And that's not an unhuman sort of thing. I mean, they were people. When being oppressed is not a good thing. And this was an opportunity to sort of show where they stood. But it also made sense in the long run, because the whole process of God's plan would never have come about if they'd have changed that. So it's quite interesting. Sometimes you can do your head in when you start thinking about these things. But that's the beauty of the Word as well, because remember, as you understand more and get closer to God, His Word opens up to you. Having read many books in my life, the Bible is probably one of the most interesting, because you can start reading it over as soon as you get to the end, and it's a whole new story. It does do that. And it's not because somebody has got in your ear and given you more information. It doesn't work that way. God opens up His Word to you as you get closer to Him. It's not about you getting smarter or knowing more. It's as you get closer to Him. He says, here's a bit more of my plan. Because He knows that we would not be able to understand this in our own strength. And in fact, that's the message we get when the fact that the Jews missed the Messiah. They had been waiting for this person. They had their eyes open. The Old Testament, which is something they knew inside out, don't forget, they could repeat it without reading it. So they knew exactly who they were looking for, and they knew they had him. But for some reason, they never made that actual connection. It's a really sort of crazy thing. But that's important that we remember those things, and for all those things you said are 100% true. And it's funny that one of the nice things about being in this country is that we actually have lots of freedoms. Although we don't always realise too, we're also one of the most regulated countries in the world, believe it or not. Australia actually has a lot more laws, regulations and requirements than a lot of countries around the world. It's actually a funny thing, but it's true. But all of them have been designed so that we have freedoms. That sounds strange. We're heavily regulated, but we have freedoms. And we do, because we don't get into trouble for going out and telling people who we are. We don't get into trouble for going out and having a good time. We find ourselves in trouble if we then take that good time to a point where we're now impinging on the rights of other people to have a good time. And whether it's because of the way that our nation came about, that we have this belief that we need to be regulating, I don't know, or it's just become a habit. It's probably just become a habit. And I think we have lawmakers in this country who see incidences occur and say, hey, we don't want that to keep happening, so they'll pass a law or a statute or something that says you can't do that. But they try not to make it so that you can't do anything, but sometimes we get to crazy. And I have spoken before about some of the crazy laws that different states hold in Australia. For example, taxi drivers in Queensland are still, to this day, meant to carry a bale of hay in their boot. And that's never been taken off the books. That goes back to the horse and carriage days of taxis. And that was purely to make sure that their animal, the horse, was fed and looked after. And we've just never taken it off the books. And there is crazy things like that. And I'm just thinking after Luke and where could I go with that? Because it showed me that John had been a forerunner of Jesus, and Jesus had come along to not only save us, but to show us what life as a Christian was going to be. And he was very careful to show us that our role was going to be that of spreading the word. And it was going to be that of helping people. And it was going to be that of being a pillar in our society. Because even though his ministry was only short, in that short time, he did become a pillar in his environment. We sometimes overlook that. But if you think about the number and the multitudes of the crowds that followed him around, particularly as we're getting, and we're looking at Luke on Thursday, we're getting to the point where we're starting to see the miracles that he did. And he had lots and lots of people follow him around. So he was a pillar in his society, and people were looking at his behaviour. And if you'd have told me 15 years ago that in Australia I would be thinking about what it's like to be a Christian and how that is going to become a difficult task, I probably would have laughed at you. I know that in having grown up, we've always joked about Christians, and we've always given the Catholic Church a hard time. And I actually remember growing up, one of the shows that my father used to like to watch was Dave Allen, the Irish comedian, a Catholic himself, who was always making fun of the Catholic Church, and we got a good laugh out of that. And funnily enough, people today would probably say, "Oh, that's irreligious" or whatever, and he shouldn't have poked fun at God or the church or whatever. But in fact, I could always picture that God was probably up there laughing his head off, saying, "That's exactly right. That's exactly how you people behave." And one of the things that we have forgotten is that God has a sense of humour. I know he does, because I'm a Christian. So he has to have a sense of humour. But he did. And he saved us. And so this concept of just because I now profess to be a Christian, I'm going to have to worry about people saying things about me or whatever. It's a strange thing to think about. And it shows how things have changed in our society in the last few years. And that, of course, is exactly what John the Baptist was trying to show, that in his time, things were changing. He knew that he was going to be baptising the coming Messiah, and he knew that society was going to change, and that was what he had preached to his disciples. And then, of course, when Jesus came along and was baptised, and God had proclaimed him as his son, he was the beginner of change. And these days, one of the things that we do as Christians need to be thinking about is the fact that we're going to be more and more persecuted. Now, I say more and more because it's actually never stopped, which is something that surprised me. I didn't think about it until the Holy Spirit started putting a little bit more on my heart, particularly Friday night as I was planning some of this. And it really is a sad truth that in Australia now we're going to see more and more persecution of Christians, partly because, as I'll get to a bit later, we're becoming a minority. And not because people are dropping away. That's exactly what I thought when I first looked into that. Then the Holy Spirit had spoken and said, "Remember, you're becoming a minority in your country." And I thought, well, okay, put my thinking hat on. I thought, well, is that true? Because the number of Christians that I know seems to be not dropping away. They're still the same number. Some of them may have moved away from the church for a moment, but they're still a Christian. They still behave Christian, so that couldn't be right. So why are we becoming a minority? Well, maybe the world's changing, and that's something that we need to look at. And in fact, as you're going to see a bit later, the world is changing. And it's changing exactly the same way as we saw in Jesus' lifetime, because he was a catalyst of change in his environment. Again, it was only a small environment because in those days they didn't have aircraft to travel around the world. But if you think about the change that he brought into that region, it was huge. And it did cover a fairly vast amount of land. So what is persecution? I guess if we're going to say that there's persecution against Christians is going to probably grow a little bit in this country, we need to think about what it is. And it's actually acts of hostility and ill treatment towards others because of their race, political or religious beliefs. Now, for a long time we've been very aware and been made very aware by the media that we've had a problem of persecution race-wise and particularly around political environments. We see in Britain a lot of issues over the religious, the political battle there. And it's interesting that other nations have actually influenced the way now that the British Parliament works. They have changed their constitution to enable and ensure that there is people from foreign lands, who now reside and call themselves Britons, represented in their parliament. And that's a huge change. Now, here in Australia, we don't particularly mind where you come from. If you want to become a member of our parliament, that's quite okay. Although, as we've seen from the last few years, you have to declare where you come from. Otherwise, we get up in arms, which I always thought was a strange thing, but did it really matter? I mean, we wasted a huge amount of parliamentary money and time because somebody's mum comes from New Zealand or they were born in, who cares? Yeah, and that's one of the things that as an Australian annoyed me. Well, I didn't care. They live here. Ergo, they're Australian. Yeah, and that's one of the strengths of the United States. I mean, it has a far larger mixture of cultures and races in it than anyone else. And they do have persecution because of race, we know that. And when you have that larger number of people, you can't avoid that. But they don't have this problem. They tried it once when Barack Obama was elected to president. They tried that. He's not an American, etc., because his mum was born here and he actually didn't tell us that he came from Kingston. And in fact, the whole thing fell apart because of the American Constitution that said he lives here, therefore he is an American. Yeah, and to me, that was right. And that's part of this persecution on race. We say they don't come from here. That doesn't matter. If they live here, then they should be Australian. And I know we run into problems where racial groups and things tend to isolate themselves and become small communities and not become part of the larger community. That's human nature. They feel more comfortable amongst their own people, and I can understand that. And I don't think we should ever give people a hard time for that, but we do. And I remember growing up as a young man, across the road from us was a Greek family. I remember a time when having a Greek family in your neighbourhood was fairly unusual. Not that anything that was a problem, nobody cared, but it was actually quite nice. Although he did disturb the neighbourhood, I remember, because he dug up his front lawn and planted a vegetable garden, which of course upset a lot of people. It's not the Australian thing, because you've got to have your hills hoist in the backyard and your Victor lawnmower and wonderful green grass out the front. He didn't do that. But of course, after a few months, when the vegetables were ripe and he's handing them out to all the neighbours and everything, it was okay. But it was funny that people weren't worried about where he came from, as the fact that he dug up his front lawn was more disturbing to people than anything else. And that's been the Australian way. But now that's changing. And so persecution is an issue, and religious persecution in this country is something that is starting to pick up. Now we're starting to see more and more agitation around your religion rather than where you come from. We're seeing more agitation and angst, real anger about what people say about their religious beliefs rather than what they say about how they believe the country should be run. So we're quite happy for people from other countries to come and complain about Australia not being a nice place. We'll live with that. But if they come here and then try and tell us that their religion is better than ours, we get up in arms. So the balance away from persecution being about politics or race has really changed. We're so used to this mixture of races, we don't think about it anymore. It's funny, the news continues to try to do that and talks about if he came from here or they belong to that. But in Australia, we don't particularly care where people come from. You go to the football and you're in there amongst a whole group of people and they come from all over the world. Nobody cares. You're just wearing the same colour scarf and you're a team. That's something that hasn't changed. But now you talk about religion in this country and you will get yourself an argument. And that's the big worry. And religious persecution is recognised as being the systematic mistreatment of an individual or group of individuals as a response to their religious beliefs or affiliations, in fact. It actually says in full definition, or lack thereof, which I always thought was interesting because that actually means we cover atheists in that. They thought they got away with it, but they get persecuted too. Sadly, sometimes from the church itself, we persecute them. Atheists are those who we should be reaching out to the most, because they actually have a strong belief, stronger than us sometimes. And that strong belief is what we should turn around. Not change, as in take away the strength of a belief, but change their focus. Because they're looking for the same thing that we found. They've just found something different. But they believe in it fervently. They'll argue with you. We've seen videos on it, haven't we? We've spent some time looking into that. And so we shouldn't be judging them. We shouldn't be worried about them. We should be giving them the good news. And being prepared to take their arguments, because that is how it should be. In fact, if you think back again to the time of Jesus and in their time, they were willing to have long discussions. After all, they didn't have radio, television or Netflix. So discussion was all they had, and they would talk. And because of that way their society was, they would also listen. One of the problems we face today is that if we try to talk to these people about our beliefs in the Bible, they'll shout you down. Because they don't have that concept now of they should listen to our side of the argument. And then, of course, we should close our mouth and let them have their say and take it in turns. And it's not always about converting someone or changing them, but it's about, as we've heard in the word, planting the seed.
Yeah, that's right.
We don't have to harvest it. We don't even have to water it. That's not our responsibility.
Yep.
Our responsibility is to plant it. Our responsibility changes if somebody comes to us who's had a seed planted and is looking for more. Then we do water it. But remember, it says plant your seed and then move on. And that makes sense. And we should talk to these people. But we've lost the art of conversation. You know, we tend to want to have our say rather than let someone else have their say. And we as Christians cop that as a criticism a fair bit these days, and unfortunately it's deserved. And I will put my hand up to say I'm in that boat too. You know, I'm fervent. I want to make sure they get out there. Is persecution of Christians something new? Absolutely not. It's gone on from the beginning. In fact, we see Jesus ending up on the cross as the greatest persecution. You can't get much more persecuted than hung on a tree. That to me is the ultimate persecution. And maybe that's why so many people cut trees down in their garden. They're just not taking a chance. You can't string me up if I haven't got one. No, it's probably not that, but who knows? I haven't actually ever asked them. For us living in Australia, though, it's probably something that's new for us to consider. Because we've never really given it a thought. We've never had to think about other people coming up to us and saying, I don't like you because you're a Christian. We've never had that before. I've had people come up to me and say, I don't like you because you're a St Kilda supporter. Hey, I can live with that. That's the Australian way. But you've never had to worry about these things. But times are a-changing. And so we do have to think about that. We are still protected. We still have the rights. And we certainly are not stopped. If I wanted to go down to the marketplace today and say my piece, as long as I don't run down other people, then they can't do a thing about it. They may ask me to move on.
Yeah.
That's the worst they can do. No, but they can't send the boys in blue to handcuff me or anything like that, unless I speak ill of other people, because that's not right. Funnily enough, though, that's just common sense. But of course, in Victoria, they've actually passed rules about that, where you can't run down other religions, you can't speak badly about other religions, and we've seen pastors in the recent past locked up for making comments on a Sunday. The funny thing about that law is it doesn't go the other way, and it's one of the ones that's being looked at to get changed, because it's actually caused quite a bit of problem in Victoria. And it's interesting that some of the ones who want to see that changed are not the Christians. Funnily enough, because that same rule can impinge on their own rights. The Bible tells us, in fact, that persecution has been a constant companion of those who follow the way of Christ. It even says in there, doesn't it? It tells us in black and white, and in more than one scripture, it tells us that as soon as we follow Jesus, we are going to be persecuted. And as a proof of that, it says he was. And from the time that he started his ministry, he was. As soon as he spoke up and went against what the Sadducees and Pharisees believed to be the truth, that is the law of the Old Testament, they were all over him. And we've been seeing that in Luke. Now, they couldn't believe the things that he did and said. They were all wrong as far as the keepers of the law were concerned. And remember that the Jews were very good at keeping the law. They were very good at it. They never missed. They never missed a sacrifice. They never missed the day of rest. They were always in the places they needed to be. But Jesus overturned that. But he never broke any of their laws. He was in the synagogue on a Sunday. He would have obeyed the Sabbath. He did all of those things. But it's the way he acted and the things that he said. And then, of course, many times, and this is why you wonder why the Jews missed it, he actually told them that he was the Son of God, that he was doing these things because his Father had set them up. So who better to know about what I'm allowed to do than me? And in their anger and in this persecution complex that people have, they missed it. They just saw it as he's doing the wrong thing. He's going to get us into trouble. He's going to get the Romans angry. Worse, and this is the funny part, he's going to get God angry. Because don't forget, they were God-fearing people. They really were. So their fear was twofold. He's going to get God angry, and he's going to get the Romans angry as well. And they're probably more worried in the beginning about the Romans being angry because after all, they were running the place, and a spear in the back of your head is not a good thing. And if we look back to how that goes about, it's actually very interesting. It's hard to identify who were the first Christians. I did a little bit of looking into that because if Christians have been persecuted right from the start, who were the first Christians? Well, actually, the first Christians were actually Jews, of course, although they didn't call themselves Christians, did they? No, they identified themselves very clearly, and of course they do today still as Jews, as they should, because they were the Jewish nation. In fact, that's an important part of God's plan, because remember that Jesus is going to come back to his people, the Jews. And that doesn't mean we're going to get locked out as Gentiles, by the way. I did check up on that. That says no, we're all good. A Christian these days is described as one who professes belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ. So a Christian comes from Jesus Christ. So it's always a grey area. Is a Christian somebody who goes to church? Is a Christian somebody who belongs to this denomination or that denomination? No. It's somebody who says, I believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ. So I read the word and I believe what I see in that. And I think sometimes that's what causes some of our confusion. And particularly, I guess, in the last 5 years or so, where we've seen issues within the Catholic Church. Everybody has labelled those problems as being a Christian problem. We understand that that's an organisational problem that their church had. And while that's a terrible thing, it really should stay in their church and they should be left to deal with it under the laws of the land. And it shouldn't be that we the rest of us have to deal with that. That said, we do, and we need to understand that very much that's part of why we find ourselves in a position of people don't like us. And you hear the comment all of the time. Why should the church in Australia be given all these wonderful privileges when it goes and does that with their privileges? But in fact, the privileges had nothing to do with the Catholic Church's behaviour. And unfortunately, probably not just the Catholic Church these days. Interesting enough, if you look up a little bit more about what people believe about Christians, they see Christians as being people who treat other people in a kind and generous way, which I thought was nice. So the general world feeling, although hopefully it's not changing too fast, is that we're a generous people, and that's interesting because a couple of years ago, the British government, when all those migrants were coming out of Africa into Europe and flooding the countries in Europe, and they didn't know what to do with this huge influx of people. I mean, Germany, for example, turned these people away because they said, our country's full. Sorry, country's full. And they weren't making that up. I mean, they don't forget, we're still reeling and dealing with the breakdown of East Germany and things like that. I mean, I know that was several years ago, but yeah, the economic downfall of that is still something we're dealing with. So this influx of people was a huge problem. And in Britain, they've been spending a fair bit of time in their parliament trying to dissemble the Christian church, because they want to remove all of the privileges that churches have. The fact they're considered as charities and they don't have to report how much money they earn and things like that. And while the government there is in the middle of doing that, with all these refugees flooding through Europe, the government goes to the church, we can take more of these people if you're willing to look after them. So on one hand they're trying to get rid of them, and then on the other they're saying, hey, we need your help. And it's that sort of, I guess, double-jointed thing that is what we have to deal with today. Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. So yeah, we are known as generous, and of course, quick plug for OFC, we are too. Now we support lots of things, and we may have forgotten, but we used to support Zimbabwe. We supported a missionary in Zimbabwe. We as a small church are actually responsible for the planting of over 20 churches in Zimbabwe, which is something that over the years we've sort of forgotten about, but I haven't actually done it. It's commonly believed that the first use of the term Christian was in around 1526. So up until then, there was Jews and Gentiles commonly termed, or just the country that you came from. But the term Christian was sort of coined in 1526. Basically, that, as it says, to describe the disciples of Jesus Christ. So that's the first time that we were probably labelled. And so it became not just Gentiles, so it was basically, they had the Jews who were looking for their Messiah, and the Gentiles who heard the message, because the message wasn't just for the Jews, who heard the message and had actually picked up who Jesus was. Jesus did have a close group of supporters that he called his disciples, and as we've read in Luke, John the Baptist also had disciples. And a disciple is just basically somebody who follows you. They listen, you teach them, they do things for you. Not slaves, but another group. Jesus' fame spread, and he gathered a large number of followers. And we see that when we look at the Sermon on the Mount. There's so many people crowded in to hear what he said. When he was out doing his miracles, he was followed by a crowd of people. And it's interesting that in the Bible you read that he actually said, this is probably the one time that Jesus probably didn't get the picture, is he told these people, don't say anything about what you see. I don't want huge amounts of people following me. So when you see me do these miracles, keep it to yourself. Like that wasn't going to happen. Yeah, I mean, it might have been 2,000 years ago, but human nature hasn't changed. We love to gossip. It's what we do. After Jesus' death is when we see his church really take off. So while he was alive and he ran his ministry, it was a small ministry that had just the disciples. There was more than 12. He had a slightly larger number than 12 disciples, but 12 were his intimate group that he took the time to train up. That makes sense, actually. Take a small group, train them up, and then let them train other people. It would have been very difficult for him to teach 3,000 people, this is what I want you to do, go out and do it, because that would never work. But having an intimate group that could then train others and others actually made sense. After his resurrection, the disciples went far and wide and mentioned what had happened. They told people what had happened, and they gained followers and disciples of their own. So the church really started from them, which makes sense of why we don't hear the term Christian until a fair way down the track. Because remember, they were spreading into different countries, and so they were all over the place. And if we look in Acts 10, you don't have to. It talks about a message given by God to Simon Peter. So he was given a vision, and then he was invited by Cornelius to come and speak. And so he spoke about that vision. And in Acts 10 from 34 to 48 it says, then Peter opened his mouth. This is after he's got to the meeting with Cornelius, and said, in truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality. He's not talking here about God punishes everybody equally. That's not what Simon Peter was saying. But in every nation, Whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. So this is where God has realised the Jews have missed the plot. And so the Gentiles now get to move the message. And that was always the plan, wasn't it? Because if you think about that, and I did think about this, if the Jews had identified that Jesus was the Messiah, then it would only be the Jewish people that ever got saved. So God's plan is to save everybody on the earth, as we all get paradise. That's originally what the Garden of Eden was all about. There was our paradise. That's the example of what heaven's going to be like for us. And it was all there. It wasn't just for the Jews, it was for everybody. But of course then we know what happened there. So then the Jewish nation was those he'd chosen, that's where he brought his son to, and the idea was to start there and spread out. And that seems a bit strange, why the Jews, were they better than anyone else? No, they just happened to be a more organised racial group in that territory at the time, and those areas around where Israel was and is today, in Syria and all those nations, that was the most populous part of the world at that time. And so you can see that God knew exactly what he was doing. We sometimes wonder why there, but that makes sense. That's where people were. And so it'd be no good trying to start his church in a little island somewhere with 3 people. That was never going to work either. So he goes about that. So now Simon Peter's passing on this vision, which is saying that God wants his word spread to every nation. He's not worried about who it is. So he's saying the word which God sent to the children of Israel, you missed it, I'm going to give it to everyone else. He never took it from the Jews, just he decided that everyone else needed to be part of that. And then, after Jesus' death and resurrection, we see that, and this follows on in Acts 11, that the church was scattered. So his disciples and his followers had to scatter, they had to run. And it says in Acts 11:19, now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose travelled as far as Cyprus, Antioch, all around the world. The world in their case, so all of the land places they could get to. So the church spread, not because people got on the phone and rang up their mates and said, hey, look, this is what's happening, but because of persecution. So Jesus had disturbed the peace of the place so badly that anybody who claimed that they were a follower or a disciple were persecuted. We see that again in the Word and there's a lot of strength in that. But again, it's that part of the master plan. If that hadn't happened, then the church would have only ever formed in a small place. And don't forget, they didn't have newspapers and other things like that. So the only way the word was ever going to get out was to do that. Why through persecution? Well, don't forget, the persecution is because these people had different ideas to those in the areas they were living in. And like all human nature, if your ideas are different, you're going to get persecuted. Persecution in this case didn't necessarily mean they were killed, although we sadly know that a lot of them were. But don't forget, it was violent times as well. And very much, they believed very much in the law of an eye for an eye. And they had very strict rules and things like that. You transgressed the law, you paid for it. And in fact, we still see that in a lot of nations, that attitude is still very much how their law is progressed. In the Western world, we've probably changed that a little bit. We tend not to be quite so lethal with our punishment anymore. Although I did see this week that in Texas they're going to actually execute some prisoners who have been on death row for a number of years. Their appeals have run the gauntlet, and the law says unfortunately we have to do that. So they're actually going to do it, which is an interesting sort of thing. But that will certainly stir some conversation soon. But again, remember that America is a Christian nation and their laws are based on the Bible, same as a lot of Australian laws are, although we have watered them down over the years. And I think sometimes that we've watered them down to our own detriment. So we see that persecution is nothing new. So Jesus was persecuted to death. We see his disciples and his early followers persecuted enough that they had to leave. They had to leave the area around Jerusalem. They had to move out and they spread. But they took the word with them. And remember that they'd been told that to spread that word. And so they did. And even though it cost them their lives, they still spread it. And this concept of having some close group disciples who you would train and then they would spread the word, that was an effective way of doing it. And so effective, in fact, that the Christian church spread to the whole world. And we know that. We know that because we're part of it. We also know that there's been many changes over the years, hasn't there? We've splintered the Christian church in many cases. We know that Henry VIII did that. He didn't get what he wanted from the Catholic Church, so he started his own. And that's probably not the best thing to advertise, but it's a reality of what happened. And we know that, we've seen crazy religions pop up and disappear. And that's covered in the Word. Jesus knew that would happen. And that's why he has the book. That's why we have the Bible, because there, at the end of the day, is your foundation. If you're not sure if some group who claims to be Christian is right or not, look at their beliefs. If it isn't in the Word, then they're not true believers and followers of Jesus Christ, which is the term that we use for being Christians. We know that Nero blamed the Roman Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. It's very well documented that when the fire had destroyed Rome, he blamed the Christians for it and went after them quite heavily. Up until that time, believe it or not, the Christians and the Romans had a fairly good relationship. In 98 to 117 AD, a gentleman called Pliny was appointed the governor of Bithynia and Pontus by the Emperor Trajan. When he encountered Christians in his area, so he came in to be the governor of this region, there was Christians there. So he actually wrote to the emperor, said, what do I do with these people? So he never encountered them before, but there was no law that said, knock them off. So he was told, basically, leave them alone. So even though we have had this persecution, it hasn't been a systematic and written down sort of thing. It's happened, and it just depended on who was running the area at the time. And that goes back to, if you think about it, what persecution is all about. Just if somebody doesn't like what you believe in, they're going to hound you. It's not a systematic sort of thing. And we should point out that Christians aren't the only religious group that get persecuted. We know through history that anybody who has an idea that doesn't match the rulers tend to wear things out. And other religious groups will always pick on religious ideas that don't meet their own because they want them taken out. It's a sad fact. So yes, we probably have never thought about persecution or what it would be like as Christians in Australia to be persecuted, but it's going to happen. In the West, it's because persecution has not always been obvious. In a lot of societies, and this is fairly prevalent in America, not so much here, Christians may be quietly excluded from social activities. They might be passed up for promotion or pay increases. And in fact, there's one of the things that Donald Trump has been addressing is just that problem in America, where Christians who work in organisations that are not necessarily owned by Americans find themselves being paid less, and he's actually been dealing with that. So we don't hear about it very much, but it actually happens. They certainly may be ridiculed for their beliefs, and in fact, even in our workplace sometimes you get that, the gentle ribbing from your workmates, what did you do on Sunday? What are you going to church? And it's all, and that in itself isn't persecution, that's just a bit of good fun, but that itself can easily expand. They could receive lower grades from their teachers or even be bullied. Now, we haven't come across that much yet, but there is even in Australia evidence that those sort of things do occur. So it's something we need to be aware about. The good thing, though, is in the West, so when I say the West, America, Britain, most of Europe, Australia, we're still free to worship as we choose. Right? So I can't lose my job because I come to church on a Sunday. I can't lose my job because I'm up here today bringing you this message and I'm going to put it on YouTube tonight. But it's not going to happen. I could get into all sorts of trouble if I were to run down Muslims or something like that, and quite rightly so, because there's no need to do that. This historical freedom, though, is rapidly changing. We see in Europe, in particular, that there's a greater intolerance and hate towards Christians. We're seeing that more and more. The Muslim community have for a long time tried to have the Holocaust taken out of the history books, saying that it never happened. They had quite a big campaign in Britain to actually have that taken out of schools. And so they do. There is a lot of changes that they want us to try. And the Bible tells us in a number of places, as I said before, that we're warned that this is going to happen. In John 18, from 18 to 20, it says, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you." That's Jesus talking to us. And he's right. They hated him from the time he started his ministry. He was a marked man. And that's why, sadly, his ministry didn't last long, because they were pretty nasty, weren't they? If you were of the world would love you as its own. So as soon as I stop being a Christian and go out and party, get drunk, take drugs, have a good time, then the world's going to love me. They're not going to look at me as being strange or weird. But as soon as they find out you go to church on a Sunday, but because you are not of the world, and here's a bit that should make us feel really good, but I chose you out of the world. We're protected, but that's why the world hates us. They hate us because we've been chosen. Sadly, though, they forget that they've been chosen too, but they turn their back. And that's the bit that often gets missed these days, is that they were chosen too. God didn't just say, "I'm going to pick you and you and oh yeah, you and you up the back, you're good." Yeah, he chose us all. And then he said, "You make up your mind. I give you the greatest gift of all, free will." And unfortunately, we've abused that. And he goes on to say that, "Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is no greater than his master." That is, because we follow Jesus, we are going to wear the same punishment. And we see that that's very much a worldly thing. When you destroy a family, you take out their homeless servants, the whole sorts of things like that. So we're going to be persecuted because he was. And we see now these days more and more news about Christians being persecuted around the world. It's getting into the mainstream media a lot more. If you go searching the internet, you'll find there's a large number of organisations now who monitor Christian persecution. Not just mention it, they monitor it. The fact that groups are monitoring this indicates that it really has become an issue. It really has. In July this year, a number of Christians in India were beaten up by Hindus. So a group of about 10 Christians were beaten up by a mob of more than 100 Hindus. And when they reported this to the police basically said, "We're not going to do much about it, but we will go and report it." As in that, because it's been reported, then they had to go and investigate it. Now, nothing came of that. It was investigated, and the police indicated that there wasn't enough evidence for them to get overly concerned. So the Christians in that area, of course, live in fear. And interestingly enough, in India, they actually have a religious freedom bill that says all religions in that country are free to speak. Now, what's happened since they've passed that is the traditional Indian religions have taken it upon themselves to try and put the Christians down. Because more and more people in India are saying, "Hey, I want to follow Jesus." And they're letting themselves be converted. And of course, Hindus, etc., are feeling very threatened. It's interesting, isn't it? So they've passed a law saying that there's religious freedom. Now there's probably less religious freedom because those who are the larger number are feeling threatened. That's not a good thing, but it is human nature and reality. Just recently in the Philippines, they've reopened a church that was destroyed by terrorist bombers, which I think is great. They've reopened it. They didn't let them win. It's funny, though, that you probably haven't heard about that. It got a few lines in the paper to say, "Hey, we're rededicating it." And I remember when the church was actually blown up, it got about 2 minutes on the news. Interesting when you look at that in the light of what happened in Christchurch, where sadly, and I say sadly because it should never happen, those Muslims going to their prayer time were attacked and shot and killed. And irrespective of religion, that shouldn't happen. But look at the outcry over that. It was amazing. And now you've got the New Zealand Prime Minister, who now thinks she's one of the world's greatest leaders because of people were killed in her country. I'm not quite sure why she's taken on that as a badge, but she because of her reaction, she now thinks she's a great leader. Yeah, and it's still going. They talk about it still. And if it had been a Christian church, how much reaction do you think it would have got? Oh, that's terrible. Let's go and find out who did it. You know, and really sort of crazy. So while we see these things happen, and it's really sad, it's a pointer that, you know, as Christians, we're going to find ourselves in that same boat. And what's probably most scary is how Christianity is changing in our country. So in the census in 2016, 30% of Australians stated they had no religion. Now that's an increase, a large increase over the previous one. And so people are now starting to say, I don't have a religion. The same-sex marriage bill that passed in 2017, and that's been that long, has also put pressure on the freedom to practice religion. And many of us who read the bill saw that there was a bit tacked on the end of that about religious freedom. Now, a lot of people voted yes to that because, you know, it was covered in, hey, you know, people should be allowed to do what they like. And so a lot of people just said, oh yeah, that's right, yeah, it's a free country, we should be allowed to do what we like. Not looking into the big picture. And it's a problem in Australia in that we tend to listen to our media and not actually read between the lines. Now, I'm not saying that the media lied to us, because they didn't. To make that clear. But we didn't read what was going on. And now, just like India, Australia is about to revamp, redo, reintroduce its religious freedom bill. That's it. Despite all the other things that you see going on, that's what Scott Morrison's actually trying to pass through Parliament at the moment. A bill that says that in Australia you are free to practice religion at all times and that nobody can take that right away from you. That scares me for two reasons. Firstly, in Australia, why would we be worrying about that sort of thing? Now, we've had religious freedom statutes and rules in all of the states for many years. Again, for the same reason as we've had all those other laws, is that if you want to give people freedoms, you've got to protect them, because people will always try and impinge on other people's freedom. I get that. But now to make it a major political point is really an issue. It also highlights the fact that in Australia now persecution of religion, and particularly of the Christian religion, has reached such a stage that it's now becoming front and centre. And that in itself is really a worry. And the Christian group Open Doors, who have been monitoring Christian persecution around the world for some time, recently released their figures for last year. So last year, that's 2018, over 245 million Christians experienced high levels of persecution. Not half a dozen, 245 million Christians. That's the ones they know about. That's a scary number. 4,305 Christians died for their faith. 1,847 churches and other Christian buildings were attacked. Did you hear about many of those? Scary, isn't it? 3,150 Christians were detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, or imprisoned. So just last year, Christians around the world found themselves really, really suffering. And we don't hear much about it, but we're going to, because it's ramping up. Will the persecution of us as Christians intensify as the return of Jesus gets closer? Lots and lots of people believe so. Given the history, the the person we most believe in was persecuted. Our church started because of that persecution, which is a good thing. You get worried about persecution when you think about it, but in fact, without it, we wouldn't be where we are. And the Bible told us that being Christian was going to be a task. So yeah, many Christian leaders believe that in fact will be the case. Not all of them. You'd be surprised how many believe it won't change, and we'll just be as persecuted as we always have been. Maybe they're right. But the Bible tells us to expect it. So what are we to do? Simple. We maintain our faith, pray, and fellowship with other Christians. That's all we need to do. Alrighty, so hopefully that wasn't a bit of a downer, but it was just a bit of a surprise to me how the Christian church has always been put upon. Thought that was interesting. Then when I looked into it, it became a bit more interesting, and it just came to me that was where we needed to go. I was a little bit put out though by those numbers from Open Doors. They're bigger than I thought. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for coming. Enjoy Sunday. Stay if you want to have a bit of a coffee. I know the numbers are down. I know the numbers are down a little bit.